quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
Rich, I was wondering, when in our society has body positivity or the promotion of such equated healthy?
I wouldn't say that it's always been that way, but it's been that way for a long time. We're in this modern area where we're seeing this body positivity with people that are overweight, for example, and it being equated to healthy. I'll get into that in a second, but if you rewind the clock, like when I was in high school or even younger than even in elementary for that matter, like there was this unattainable standard of these skinny models, for example, that were oftentimes like, oh, well, the young girls of our society are trying to reach this standard, which was unattainable. And so it led to all these, there was tons of discussions about bulimia and anorexia, and those were big problems like in the 80s and 90s. Like those are the conversations I grew up with, right?
It used to be huge in school.
Yeah. Yep. And even myself, for example, I've talked about this before. Like I grew up in a family of big men, and I was a small guy. And my dad was a large, imposing man. He was 6'4", 285 pounds when he was younger and in shape. And obviously, that changed as he got older, but my father was the strongest man I knew, and I always wanted to grow up to be like him. But growing up, was me and my younger brother, like we were the runts of the family, the skinny kids. And so when I graduated high school, I was somewhere between 155, 160 pounds. Now, my junior year of high school is where I initially started getting into nutrition, and then it just took off from there. It became like this forest fire that just spread. And obviously the more you study, the more you learn. And so after I graduated high school, my freshman year of college, I hit a growth spurt. I grew another inch and some change. And by midway through my sophomore year of college, I had put on about 40, 45 pounds from where I weighed when I graduated. And most of that was muscle, because I was nose deep in all these muscle magazines, reading about nutrition and protein and the importance of all this stuff. And so I had completely changed my body composition. Now, I previously mentioned that I've suffered from a bit of, I'll call it insatiability, but really that's just masquerading like this tiny little bit of body dysmorphia. I look in the mirror, and when I look at myself, I see I'll see more things that I'd like to fix than more things that I could appreciate, which is odd because especially at my age, from the neck down, but I would argue that my physique is actually better now than it was when I was competing as a professional athlete, because of the kind of training that I'm doing and everything else. And there are other factors of that, talk about nutrition and the amount of training that I do. Like there's tons of things that go into that, but nonetheless, I could still look at myself in the mirror and say, oh, I'd like to tweak this, or I'd like to fix that. And I talk about that attitude of insatiability being a double-edged sword. Where that is what drove me my entire athletic career. Like when I'm in the gym practicing technique, well, I'm going to get better at this tomorrow and better at this the next day. It's what this attitude of insatiability is what drives a concert pianist to become better at their craft or whatever it may be that you're doing. But for me, this kind of took its roots physically in the way that my body looked. And of course, in the 80s and the 90s, I grew up on this healthy dose of Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and Van Damme movies, right? Where much like the girls who are looking at the Cosmo magazines, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is my goal. And this is for me, if I'm looking to have a Schwarzenegger physique, it's an unattainable goal because I've pretty much at this age reached my genetic potential. I'm 48, and it's going to get more and more difficult to maintain this. So I had to reach a point in time where I'm like, I need to appreciate what I got, because I'm going to look back at pictures of myself and scratch my head and say, why couldn't you look in the mirror and appreciate these things? Now, we have this modern society of social media, for example, and these people that are looking at social media, and I don't know, you grew up with social media. Actually, you talked about this. You talked about what happened with you after cancer. Tell that story.
Yeah. So before cancer, I was training with the varsity wrestling squad, and I was very fit. I was the guy that did 39 pull-ups in a row and was sprinting.
That's it?
Yeah. Come on, man.
Come on, dude.
Sprinting. I ran
wait. Are those dead hang pull-ups or kipping?
Dead hang, dude. I don't do the whole CrossFit pull-ups.
I can respect that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Anyway, I'm killing your story here.
So I was this very fit young freshman, fight a life-threatening illness, right? I lose my whole fibula in my right leg. After recovery, I tried to do half the things that I could.
How much weight did you lose?
See, I was probably about 145 going in, and I weighed about 120, upper one teens. Most of that was muscle, though.
Yeah, no, of
that
course.
I lost,
And
so
that's a significant percentage of your overall.
it is. They were
body
worried.
weight.
They were very worried.
Yeah.
And I knew in the mirror I didn't look the same.
Yeah.
I looked like a skeleton going through it. And then after, I was very skinny, right? Slightly water inflated, though. You know, like the medication caused you to puff a little bit.
Yeah.
But fast forward to being in the gym. I couldn't do what I once could. So I got very depressed within my own head.
But what this depression, was it because of your inability to perform or because you physically didn't look the same?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
It started with the ankle and like, oh, you can't run, you can't do cardio, you can't do anything like that. And then it also progressed to, well, the things that I can do with my upper body, I still can't.
Yeah.
So it was like this 3-year pity me party.
But okay, so there's obviously you can't physically perform, but then the way you physically look, to what standard were you comparing yourself? The previous standard of you, I would imagine. But then I'm going to ask you this question. That standard of you, what were you comparing yourself to at that standard? Was there some sort of societal, like for me, like I talked about the Schwarzenegger and Stallone and Van Damme films, like what was it that made you think that that was the physique by which you should be?
So I'm a small guy, unlike you, and the standard that I had was the stereotypical wrestler build when you look in a textbook. That's what I wanted because that's what I was. So that's low percentage of body fat, able to, lean muscle,
But so
and able
there's
to whatever.
still this image in your head.
There was an image
by
for
which
sure.
you were living up to.
Then after cancer, with 3 years of laying around, playing a lot of video games, not leaving my room often, things like that, I inflated to an unhealthy 190. So, I was going to grow anyway, right, throughout high school. So to some degree, so some of that would have been normal, but it was that much more accelerated with my unhealthy lifestyle. And anytime I looked in the mirror, I mean, there's still one picture that haunts me, and it's because I sucked in my gut. I had a small tank top on, and I was with my siblings posing for a picture before I left for college, just trying to like look strong or look some kind of different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was hell within my head.
So, that's so you didn't have any body positivity at that point in time, right?
Nope.
But in that weight for you at 190 was obviously not healthy either. Now, whether or not you could have gotten to the point where you were comfortable in that body, and you obviously, like myself, we body shame ourselves, right? And which is not necessarily a great thing to do, but at the same time, like it's different than someone else body shaming you. And if you got to the point where you're like, you know what, man, I'm just comfortable being here, then more power to you from a body positivity standpoint,
right?
But on the flip side of that is your health, right? So now we live in this modern day world where we talk about body positivity, and man, I mean, nobody should ever suffer from body shaming. But and you look at, like, for example, when we talked about Lizzo previously, and she's representing
Peloton.
Yeah. So she's the advocate or the spokesperson. I
think one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the question is that this body positivity, when did that actually get equated with health in that direction? Because similarly, when I talked about in the 80s and 90s, like it led to all these women, these models. You've heard models talking about like the amount of bulimia and anorexia that they had in these young girls that were suffering from the same thing. Like it's unhealthy on that end of the spectrum. But when you look at something like this, it's like, well, if she's positive about her body and she's confident and she enjoys where she's at, that's great. That's awesome for her. But on the flip side of that is, how is her health?
Yeah.
Things like longevity. What's happening to her heart? What's happening to her joints? What's happening to her endocrine system?
Well, it's similar to the dad bod movement, right?
Yeah, but
I mean,
yes
'cause
and no.
I mean, to build a dad bod, you're drinking a lot, you're doing all these other unhealthy habits, right?
Agreed. I mean, you can
and
eat some unhealthy food, but I will say this, that you don't have to. My body fat is, I walk around, I'm 6'1" and I'm about 220. And when I was competing at 185, I was walking around somewhere between 205 and 210. When I was competing, when I moved up to 205 to compete, I was walking around maybe about 212, not very heavy for a 205-pound fighter. So I'm really only maybe 8 to 10 pounds heavier than I was when I was competing. But I think the composition of my physique is slightly different. I mean, you don't have to have single digit body fat to be healthy necessarily.
No, not at all.
And so there is a certain level of like junk food that you could get away with, and a certain dad bod, for example, that you could have. Like you can carry a certain amount of weight and still maintain the same health, like it not affecting your blood pressure or developing things like diabetes with insulin issues and throwing your endocrine system off that way, or damaging your joints because you're carrying too much weight. Like not everybody has to be this, physical specimen, so to speak, right?
Sometimes it's impossible.
Yeah, but if you enjoy being that way and you're comfortable that way, then great, that's awesome. But there's a point where you reach where you put on too much weight, where you're in that obese category, where and I mean, it's obviously this, you can track this through data, where it's going to affect things like your blood pressure and heart attacks or diabetes and the things that come with that, like with prolonged diabetes, a type 2 diabetes that sets in. Like, so it's like, where did we get to the point where it was acceptable to allow that level of comfort with the body to say like, no, if you're comfortable with your body, great. It's like, no, this is actually going to affect your health. It's going to affect your quality of life on the back end. And then beyond that, taking it a step further and saying, no, this is actually what we are now associating with health.
Yeah.
Right?
Which is really weird. And on the flip side of that, I think what the healthy term, right? People often think that it has to be somebody that looks like you or Sylvester Stallone in Rocky or something, right? And I think it's important to say that the point that I think that I hear from you is that it's deeper than that. It's more about just taking care of your heart and taking care of your longevity of life.
Yeah.
And so if that comes with a body image goal, awesome. But if it doesn't, then,
we've talked about this before, and I've said this, like you compete against you, right?
Right.
And I always compete against me, but I'll tell you what you compete against is you compete against the math. You compete against the science. Well, this science is the great buzzword in today's discussions.
Science.
Right? But I'll put this in a different context. When I was competing, for example, like I would wear a heart rate monitor when I'm training. I would do sprints on my treadmill. I would, whatever it was, and I would have markers for how high I would elevate my heart rate and how low I could get my heart rate. And to me, I knew, for example, that if I could drop my heart rate over 50 beats in 60 seconds, that I was where I needed to be for fight prep. Like, it's just the math of it. And this is the left brain side of me, that mathematical side. Like, this is me applying that stuff. And the reality is that, you follow the numbers. If my numbers weren't there, then I knew that my body wasn't recovering at the rate at which it needed to recover, and I wouldn't be there. Similarly, I can have the best body image of myself that even if I'm obese, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But like, follow the numbers. When you're looking at your blood pressure, or you're looking at your A1C, or you're looking at your, like any of that kind of stuff, man, it's like the numbers, the math doesn't lie. And somehow in this modern world of where we're like, trust the science, with this particular thing, we've been able to bypass the science.
Very interesting.
Quite Franklin is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor legal advice, nor a statement of Quite Franklin policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation of that product or entity by Rich Franklin or Quite Franklin. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Quite Franklin employees or representatives are the views and opinions of the persons expressing them, and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Quite Franklin or any of its officials or principals. Nothing heard on this podcast at any time is medical advice or is intended as medical advice. The listener must always consult his or her personal physician or other qualified medical professional regarding any questions of a medical nature. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact our general counsel.